A young couple had been driving down a rural highway on a stormy night, their windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the relentless downpour. The road was unfamiliar, a shortcut they had taken in hopes of avoiding the main highway's heavy traffic. But now, with each mile they drove, the road became less navigable. The rain blurred the world around them, turning it into a hazy veil of grey. The headlights illuminated nothing more than the thick sheets of water that hammered down from the sky, obscuring their vision. Their GPS kept rerouting them, taking them deeper into an unknown part of the countryside. The couple was anxious but tried to stay calm, assuming they would soon find a road sign or a place to stop and ask for directions. The couple had been in the car for over 2 hours, and as time passed, the rain only worsened. There were no signs of civilization, no lights in the distance, nothing but the sound of the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. The eerie silence made them both uneasy. It was an isolated area with forests on either side, and the deeper they went, the more the feeling of being watched crept over them. They were now relying on the car's low fuel gauge and the hope that they would stumble upon a gas station or at least a town. But the more they drove, the more it felt like they were going in circles. Just when they thought things couldn't get worse, they saw headlights through the rain. It was a truck parked at an awkward angle on the side of the road with its engine still running. It wasn't until they approached that they saw the truck was stuck in the mud. The tires were deep in the muck, and the driver had obviously been trying to get the vehicle unstuck for a while. The couple, hoping to be of help, pulled up alongside the truck, deciding to offer assistance or at least provide a phone to call for help. But as they got out of the car, the atmosphere shifted. Something was wrong. The truck's door was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of the driver. No tire tracks leading off the road, no footprints in the rain-drenched dirt. The interior of the truck looked untouched, save for the driver's seat, which was empty. The couple called out to see if anyone was nearby, but there was only the sound of rain and distant thunder. There were no other vehicles in sight, no other sounds at all. The odd stillness made their skin crawl. One of them checked the truck's back, expecting perhaps to find the driver struggling to secure something, but there was nothing. Just more rain and the unsettling sensation that they weren't alone. They called the police, describing what they had found. Authorities arrived within a short time and confirmed that the truck had been abandoned. But here's where things got strange. The truck had been left there weeks ago. There were reports of an abandoned vehicle on this stretch of highway, but there had been no sign of the driver. The police couldn't find any trace of the individual who had been driving it. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The couple was told that every year, usually during storms, a person would disappear on that very highway. Each time, the circumstances were eerily similar. A vehicle found stuck in the mud, the driver nowhere to be found, and the locals were used to hearing stories about people who went missing on that road. Some believed the disappearances were linked to something unnatural. Others claimed that the storm acted as a cover for whatever was lurking out there. No one could explain it, and the mystery only deepened. To this day, the highway is known for its strange history, and locals swear that something is out there, waiting for the next unfortunate traveler. The couple, still shaken by the eerie atmosphere of the road, decided to continue their journey despite the unsettling feeling creeping up on them. The truck, abandoned with no sign of its driver, lingered in their minds, but they didn't want to let fear control their actions. After all, they were almost out of the isolated stretch of highway, or so they thought. They reassured each other that it was just an unusual but harmless situation. They continued driving, hoping the storm would break soon. However, no matter how much they tried to shake off the fear, a sense of foreboding remained. The highway seemed endless. The couple exchanged worried glances, their eyes constantly shifting between the rain-smeared road and the dark woods on either side. The visibility was almost non-existent, the rain blurring everything around them. The sound of the windshield wipers and the storm outside was deafening, but it felt as if they weren't alone. Every now and then, the hairs on the back of their necks would stand up, an instinctual reaction to something they couldn't quite explain. At one point, the car seemed to slow down for no reason, as though the engine itself was fighting against the weather or the unseen force that seemed to be growing stronger. After what felt like an eternity, they noticed another vehicle on the road in front of them. It was another car, barely visible through the downpour. They quickly assumed it was another stranded driver, but when they got closer, they noticed something that made their stomachs churn. The car was eerily still, parked in the middle of the road, with no one inside. The couple, once again, approached the vehicle, hesitant but compelled by a strange urge to see if the driver needed help. The car's windows were fogged up, and despite the heavy rain, there was no sign of anyone around. They sat in the car for a moment, trying to decide whether to investigate further or drive past. It wasn't until the faintest sound of a door creaking open that their anxiety turned into fear. The sound was faint, but enough to make their hearts race. Their eyes darted around, and they suddenly realized that the road they had been traveling on had become much narrower, the trees closing in on either side. The storm continued to rage, and yet there was no sign of the driver of the abandoned car. With the rain coming down in sheets, they hurriedly drove past, glancing to their left, where the eerie shape of the car remained in the rearview mirror, fading into the night. Later, when they reached the nearest town, they found the local sheriff. He listened intently as they described the encounter, and though his expression remained neutral, there was a subtle tension in his voice when he told them they had unknowingly driven down a highway infamous for disappearances. The truck, the one with the missing driver. It wasn't the first time a vehicle had been abandoned under mysterious circumstances. He explained that the area had a history of strange occurrences, especially during storms. People had been known to vanish, sometimes never to be found again. The sheriff's words lingered with them long after they left his office. The couple had heard rumors of the highway, stories of strange figures seen in the rain, but they had never imagined it would be real. It wasn't just a random occurrence. There was something about that stretch of road that attracted misfortune. No one could explain the disappearances. Some said it was the weather that somehow made people lose their way, while others spoke in hushed tones of a darker force lurking in the woods. The storm seemed to trigger something, as if it brought the highway's unsettling past to life once again, and whatever force caused the disappearances wasn't ready to let go of its hold. The next day, as the couple tried to process the strange events that had unfolded on the highway, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. They had come to a small diner to warm up and discuss what had happened, but the conversation always led back to the same unsettling thoughts. They couldn't stop imagining the truck, abandoned on that desolate stretch of road, and the driver who was nowhere to be found. They had to know more. They couldn't just let it go. So the couple decided to visit the local sheriff's office, hoping to get some answers. They sat across from a sheriff who seemed to have seen it all, a man hardened by years of working in a rural town. As the couple recounted their encounter, They noticed the sheriff's eyes narrow, his lips pursing as if he had heard the story 100 times before. But when they mentioned the truck, his face changed, just slightly, a flicker of recognition passing over his features. He leaned forward, his voice lowering to a near whisper as he spoke. "You're not the first to report something like that. There's a stretch of highway, not far from here, where people vanish without a trace. It's been happening for years. No one knows why or what causes it, but it's a regular occurrence. The truck you saw, it was found abandoned weeks ago. The driver was never found." The couple sat in stunned silence. The sheriff continued, explaining that the disappearances were part of a pattern that had plagued the region for decades. Every year, it seemed, someone would disappear on that highway, often during a storm. He told them the stories were becoming part of the town's folklore, with each new disappearance adding to the mystery. Local residents had begun to avoid that stretch of road altogether, especially when the weather was bad, as if they believed it was cursed or haunted. The sheriff didn't say it outright, but there were whispers in the town about strange occurrences near the highway. Whispers that suggested something paranormal was involved. Some claimed to have seen figures in the distance during storms, figures that would disappear the moment they looked away. Others spoke of hearing voices on the wind, calling out to travelers, or feeling an overwhelming sense of dread while driving through that part of the road. There were even those who believed the highway was a portal, a place where the living and the dead somehow intertwined. The couple, both shaken and skeptical, left the sheriff's office that afternoon with more questions than answers. What had they witnessed? Was it just a coincidence, or had they stumbled upon something much darker? They drove back to their hotel, and as they passed through the countryside, the storm began to pick up again. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain beat down on the car with renewed fury. But this time, the couple wasn't thinking about the storm. They were thinking about the strange truck, the missing driver, and the cryptic warnings they had heard from the sheriff. And most of all, they couldn't stop thinking about the one unsettling truth they had learned. Whatever force haunted that highway, it was waiting for the next victim. A group of friends, eager to escape the stress of their daily lives, decided to spend a weekend in a secluded cabin deep in the mountains. They had rented the cabin through an online service, promising a cozy retreat with stunning views of the surrounding wilderness. It was a place where they could unwind away from the noise of the city and the distractions of the world. When they arrived, the weather was calm, and the cabin appeared as advertised, old, rustic, and quaint. There was something charming about the isolation, though it was also a little unsettling. But they brushed off the feeling, thinking it would be a perfect place to enjoy each other's company and the peace of nature. As night fell, a storm rolled in, and the group found themselves trapped inside by the torrential rain. The wind howled outside, causing the trees to sway and creak under its pressure. The atmosphere in the cabin grew colder, and the friends huddled near the fireplace, chatting and laughing to pass the time. But as the storm intensified, strange things began to happen. Doors that had been closed tightly earlier now creaked open on their own. Items that had been neatly arranged in the kitchen were found scattered around, as though they had been moved by invisible hands. One friend swore she had heard footsteps in the hallway, though no one else was awake. It was Mark who discovered the journal. He had wandered around the cabin, hoping to clear his head, when he stumbled upon the old leather-bound book tucked away in a drawer in the living room. The journal was worn, the pages yellowed with age, and the handwriting inside was shaky, as though written in a hurry. The journal belonged to a previous tenant of the cabin, a man who had lived there alone for several months before suddenly disappearing. His writings were disjointed, filled with descriptions of unsettling occurrences, whispers in the walls, the feeling of being watched, objects moving without explanation, and strange figures that seemed to appear in the corners of his vision. The man wrote about hearing footsteps late at night, feeling the floorboards creak under invisible weight, and the eerie cold that swept through the cabin, no matter how high the fire burned. He had tried to leave, but the storm had always kept him inside. And then, the final entry. The cabin wants me to stay. Mark had no idea what he was getting himself into when he picked up the journal. At first, it seemed like just a piece of local law, a random collection of old notes from a previous tenant. But as he flipped through the pages, his heart began to race. The journal's author had been a man named Thomas, a recluse who had rented the cabin during a particularly harsh winter. He had arrived alone, seeking solitude, but quickly grew uneasy. His writing was erratic, filled with descriptions of strange sounds, objects that moved by themselves, and the feeling of being watched at all hours of the day and night. The further Mark read, the more disturbing the journal became. Thomas wrote about a presence in the cabin, a constant, unseen force that seemed to follow him from room to room. He described a coldness that no fire could banish, an unnatural chill that lingered in the air, even as the storm outside raged. Thomas, desperate to leave, had tried to escape the cabin, but the weather kept him inside. Each time he attempted to venture out, the storm grew fiercer, trapping him in the same place where the unsettling events unfolded. The more Mark read, the more he felt the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin surrounding him. He could almost hear the whispers Thomas described in the journal, muffled but persistent, as though they were coming from behind the walls. He could sense the growing dread that had overtaken Thomas during his final days in the cabin. Mark quickly realized that the journal wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a warning. The strange happenings, the cold, the feeling of being watched, it was all still here in the cabin, waiting for the next person to arrive. That night, the friends began to experience the same things Thomas had described in his journal. The doors started to creak open by themselves, and they could hear footsteps pacing through the halls, footsteps that weren't theirs. It started with small things, objects slightly out of place, the flicker of a light, but soon it escalated. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, and no matter how much wood they threw into the fire, the coldness remained, seeping into their bones. The whispers started too. At first, they were faint, almost inaudible, but soon they were unmistakable. The friends huddled together, trying to convince themselves it was just the wind or the sound of the storm outside. But deep down, they knew it was something else, something far darker. Mark, now terrified, grabbed the journal and tried to make sense of it. The words on the pages seemed to grow more desperate, the final entries scrawled hastily, as though Thomas had been racing against time to escape something that was slowly taking over. Mark had no choice but to tell the others about the journal, and once he did, the realization set in. They weren't just in a cabin. They were in a place that held something terrible, and it wasn't going to let them leave. As the night wore on, the friends found themselves growing increasingly paranoid. What had started as an innocent getaway had turned into something far more sinister. The cabin, once a cozy retreat, now felt like a prison. The wind howled outside, making the wooden walls creak and groan as though the house itself were alive. They huddled around the fire, but the warmth it provided seemed to be swallowed up by the cold that had settled in the cabin. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and despite the crackling fire, they could see their breath in the air. Mark, who had discovered the journal, could no longer ignore the sense of dread that hung over them. It was clear that something was wrong, but none of them knew how to explain it. The whispers that had started faintly now seemed to be coming from all directions, echoing through the walls of the cabin. It was as though the cabin itself was alive, breathing in the same space as them, watching them. Each friend took turns trying to brave the night, but it quickly became apparent that no one was going to get any sleep. They decided to investigate, trying to find any clue that could explain what was happening. They began exploring the cabin, starting with the basement. They were hesitant, knowing that whatever had been haunting the previous tenant might still be lurking below, but they had to know the truth. The basement was cold and dark, the only light coming from a single lantern they had brought with them. The air smelled musty, and the floor was damp, the walls lined with old, decaying furniture. The basement was eerily quiet, but as they moved deeper into the space, they heard something. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind them. They spun around, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, and though they were sure they were alone, the sound grew louder, closer. Panic set in. The friends bolted upstairs, convinced something, or someone, was in the house with them. Once upstairs, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors that had been firmly closed slammed open and shut. The fireplace flared up suddenly, though there was no fuel to feed it. The whispers grew louder, now sounding like distinct voices, murmuring in languages they didn't understand. The walls seemed to pulse, the house breathing with them. The journal's warnings about a presence that couldn't be escaped now felt all too real. Whatever Thomas had written in those pages wasn't just the ramblings of a man losing his grip on reality. It was a forewarning of something far darker. The friends gathered in the living room, huddled together, too terrified to sleep, too frightened to leave. The storm outside had trapped them, and the storm inside was beginning to consume them. It wasn't just the cold or the whispers, it was the overwhelming sensation that something was watching them, something they could never escape. Every time one of them looked away, they thought they saw a shadow move in the corner of their vision, but when they turned to face it, it was gone. The small town was quiet, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It had a charm to it, with its cobblestone streets and old-fashioned buildings, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and where strangers were rare. It was here that a family decided to move, seeking a fresh start. The house they bought was large, old, and situated on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a thick forest. The family was excited to make it their own, but they quickly began hearing rumors from the locals. People spoke in hushed tones about a strange legend that had haunted the town for years. It was said that on stormy nights, a girl could be seen standing in the rain, staring at the people who passed by. No one knew her name or where she came from. Some claimed she was the spirit of a lost child, wandering the streets of the town, forever trapped in the rain. The family didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to local superstition. But one night, when the weather turned foul, they experienced something that made them reconsider. As the rain poured down, they noticed something strange. A figure standing in the middle of the street, completely drenched, staring at them from a distance. The girl was pale, her clothes soaked through, but her face was expressionless, as if she didn't feel the cold or the storm. The family was taken aback, unsure whether they were seeing things. When they approached her, she didn't move, didn't speak, just continued to stare. But when they got closer, she vanished, disappearing into the downpour as quickly as she had appeared. They tried to speak to the neighbors the next day, but no one knew who the girl was. Some claimed she'd been seen before, standing in the same spot, every time it rained heavily. There were whispers of a family that had lived in the house before them, a family that had disappeared without a trace, their names erased from the town's history. It was said that the girl was their daughter, forever trapped in the rain. The more they heard, the more unnerving it became. Every stormy night, the girl would reappear, always in the same spot, always staring, as if waiting for something or someone. The family had just moved into the old house on the outskirts of town, unaware of the legends that surrounded it. The house itself was beautiful, grand in its age, with sprawling rooms and an almost haunting presence. It seemed perfect, a dream home nestled in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. But from the moment they arrived, strange things started happening. It was as if the house itself was trying to tell them something, and despite the charm of their new surroundings, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The rain, which was a common occurrence in the area, added to the eeriness of their new home. The first few nights were quiet, but soon they began to hear whispers, strange, soft voices that seemed to come from nowhere. The noises were faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain, but they grew clearer with time. The family tried to convince themselves that it was just the settling of the house, the creaking of old floorboards. But each night, the whispers became louder, more persistent. One evening, when the storm was particularly fierce, the family ventured outside to explore their new surroundings. It was then that they saw her, the girl standing alone in the street, completely drenched, her face obscured by a long, wet strand of hair. Her posture was unnatural, as if she was frozen in place. She didn't seem to acknowledge their presence, and when they called out to her, she didn't respond. They hurried toward her, but by the time they reached her, she had disappeared into the torrential rain, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. The family was unnerved. The next day, they asked their neighbors if they knew anything about the girl, but no one had any answers. Some of the townspeople whispered about a tragedy that had taken place years ago, how a family had disappeared during a storm, leaving only the girl behind. The girl had been seen standing in the rain, waiting for her parents to return. It was said that she was forever trapped in the storm, unable to move on. The more the family learned, the more they realized that the girl's presence wasn't a coincidence. She was a part of the house's dark history, and no matter how hard they tried, the rain would always bring her back. The family had been living in the old house for a few months now, and they had gotten used to the strange occurrences. The whispers had faded, and while the feeling of being watched had never completely gone away, they had learned to live with it, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to experience. It was another stormy night, the rain pouring down in torrents, the wind howling through the trees. The family had just finished dinner and were settling in for the evening when they heard the familiar sound of footsteps outside. It was a strange noise, like someone walking slowly through the wet grass, and it was unmistakable. The sound came closer, louder, until they could hear it right outside the front door. They froze, not knowing what to do. The girl, she had appeared again. The father, still hoping to explain away the odd occurrences, cautiously opened the door, but there was no one there, just the relentless rain and the dark, empty street stretching out before them. They closed the door quickly, feeling the chills settle over them. The girl had been there, and now she was gone. The next day, the family spoke to more of the townspeople, trying to get any information they could about the girl. The legend of the girl in the rain had become more than just a story. It was a part of the town's dark history. The locals spoke of the family who had disappeared all those years ago, of how the girl had been seen standing in the rain, waiting for her parents to come back. She had become an almost mythical figure in the town, a ghost of the past that refused to let go. The family couldn't escape the growing sense of dread. The girl's appearances, always in the rain, were becoming more frequent. Some nights, they would hear her faintly crying, the sound muffled by the storm, but it was clear. She was still there, still waiting. It was as if the house had somehow drawn her in, keeping her bound to the place. The family realized that they were no longer just living in a house. They were living in a place that held the echoes of the past, of tragedy and loss. And the girl in the rain was just the beginning of the haunting that had taken hold of them.